get it down. Probably gonna only read on weekends though. I pretended that he could not understand my German. This could not be true, because up to then he and his wife, the old lady who had received me, looked at each other in a frightened sort of way, mumbled out that the money had been sent in a letter, and that was all he knew. Castle, both he and his wife crossed themselves, and saying that they knew nothing at all, simply refused to speak further. It was so near the time of starting that I had no time to ask anyone else, for it was very mysterious and not by any means comforting. Just before I was leaving, the old lady came up to my room and said in a hysterical way, "Must you go? Oh, young heir, must you go?" She was in such an excited state that she seemed to have lost grip of what German she knew, and mixed it all up with some other language that I did not know at all. I was just able to follow her by asking many questions. When I told her that I must go at once, and that I was engaged on important business, she asked again, "Do you know what day it is?" I answered that it was the 4th of May. She shook her head and said again, "Oh yes, I know that, but do you know what day it is?" When the clock strikes midnight, all the evil things in the world will have full sway. Do you know where you are going? Do you know what you are going to do? She was in such evident distress that I tried to comfort her, but without effect. Finally, she went down on her knees and implored me not to go, at least to wait for a day or two before starting. It was all very ridiculous, but I did not feel comfortable. However, there was business to be done, and I could allow nothing to interfere with it. I tried to raise her up, and said, as gravely as I could, that I thanked her, but my duty was imperative, and that I must go. Then she rose and dried her eyes, and taking a crucifix from her neck, offered it to me. I did not know what to do, for as an English churchman, I had been taught to regard such things as in some measure idolatrous. And yet it seemed so ungracious to refuse an old lady meaning so well in such a frame of mind. She saw, I suppose, the doubt in my face, for she put the rosary around my neck and said, "For your mother's sake," and went out of the room. I am writing up this part of the diary while I am waiting for the coach, which is, of course, late, and the crucifix is still round my neck. Whether it is the old lady's fear, or many ghostly traditions of this place, or the crucifix itself, I do not know, but I am not feeling nearly as easy in mind as usual. If this book should ever reach Mina before I do, let it bring my goodbye. Here comes my coach. The 5th of May. The Castle. The gray of the morning has passed. Oh, somebody's liking all my activities, dude. But I am not sleepy, and as I am not to be called till I wake. Did I just skip a whole thing? Yeah, I did. May the 5th. The Castle. The gray of the morning has passed, and the sun is high over the distant horizon, which seems jagged. Whether the trees or hills, I know not, for it is so far off that big things and little are mixed. I am not sleepy, and I am not to be called till I wake. Naturally, I write till the sleep comes. There are many odd things to be put down, and lest who reads them may fancy that I dined too well before I left Bistriz. Let me put down my dinner exactly. I dined on what they call robber steak, bits of bacon, onion, and beef, seasoned with red pepper and strung on sticks, and roasted over the fire, in the simple style of London cat's meat. That actually sounds so good. The wine was golden mediash, which produces a queer sting on the tongue, which is, however, not disagreeable. I had only a couple of glasses of this, and nothing else. When I got on the coach, the driver had not taken his seat, and I saw him talking to the landlady. They were evidently talking of me, for every now and then they looked at me, and some of the people who were sitting on the bench outside the door came and listened, then looked at me, most of them pityingly. I could hear a lot of words often repeated, queer words, for there were many nationalities in the crowd, so I quietly got my polyglot diary from my bag and looked them out. I must say that they were not cheering for me, for amongst them were Ordog, Satan, Porkal, Hell, Stregoisia, Witch, Velok, Vrolok, and Volkoslak. Both mean the same thing, one being Slovak and the other Serbian, or Servian, for something that is either werewolf or vampire. Mem, I must ask the Count about these superstitions. When we started, the crowd round the inn door, which had by this time swelled to a considerable size, all made the sign of the cross and pointed two fingers towards me. With some difficulty, I got a fellow passenger to tell me what they meant. He would not answer at first, but on learning that I was English, he explained that it was a charm or guard against the evil eye. This was not very pleasant for me, just starting for an unknown place, to meet an unknown man. But everyone seemed so kind-hearted and so sorrowful and so sympathetic that I could not but be touched. I shall never forget the last glimpse which I had of the inn yard, and its crowd of picturesque figures, all crossing themselves as they stood round the wide archway, with its background of rich foliage and oleander and orange trees in green tubs clustered in the center of the yard. Then our driver, whose wide linen drawers covered the whole front of the box seat, Gotza, they called them, cracked his big whip over his four small horses, which ran abreast, and we set off on our journey. I soon lost sight and recollection of ghostly fears in the beauty of the scene as we drove along. Although I known the language, or rather languages, which my fellow passengers were speaking, I might have been able to throw them off so easily. Before us lay a green sloping land full of forests and woods, with here and there steep hills crowned with clumps of trees, or with farmhouses. The blank gable end of the road, there was everywhere a bewildering mass of fruit blossom, apple, plum, pear, cherry. In and out amongst these green hills are what they call here the Middle Land, ran the road, losing itself as it swept round the grassy curve, or was shut out by the straggling ends of pine woods, which here and there ran down the hillsides like tongues of flame. The road was rugged, but still we seemed to fly over it with feverish haste. I could not understand what then the haste meant, but the driver was evidently bent on losing no time in reaching Orgobrund. I was told that this road is in summertime excellent, but that it had not yet been put in order after the winter snows. In this respect it is different from the general run of roads in the Carpathians, for it is an old tradition that they are kept in too good of order. It is difficult from the general run of roads in the Carpathians, for it is an old tradition that they are not to be kept in too good order. Of old the hospodars would not repair them, lest the Turks should think that they are preparing to bring in foreign troops, and so hasten the war in which was always really at loading point. Beyond the green swelling hills of the Middle Land rose mighty slopes of the forest up to the lofty sweeps of the Carpathians themselves. Right and left of us they towered, with the afternoon sun falling upon them and bringing out all the glorious colors of this beautiful ranch. Deep blue and purple in the shadows of the peaks, green and brown where grass and rock mingled, and an endless perspective of jagged rock and pointed crags, till these were themselves lost in the distance, where the snowy peaks rose grandly. Here and there seemed mighty rifts in the mountains, though which as the sun began to sink, we saw now and again the white gleam of falling water. One of my companions touched my arm as we wept round the base of a hill and opened up the lofty, snow-covered peak of a mountain, which seemed, as we wound on our serpentine way, to be right before us. Look! This is somebody talking now. Look! Istensek! God's seat! As he crossed himself reverently. As we wound on our endless way, and the sun sank lower and lower behind us, the shadows of the evening began to creep round us. This was emphasized by the fact that the snowy mountaintop had still held the sunset, seemed to glow out a delicate cool pink. Here and there we passed Czechs and Slovaks, all in picturesque attire, but I noticed that goiter was painfully prevalent. By the roadside were many crosses, and as I swept by, my companions all crossed themselves. Here and there was a peasant man or woman kneeling before a shrine, who did not even turn round as we approached, but seemed, in the self-surrender of devotion, to have neither eyes nor ears for the outer world. There are many things new to me. For instance, hay ricks in the trees, and here and there very beautiful masses of weeping birch, their white stems shining like silver through the delicate green of the leaves. Now and again we passed a leader wagon, the ordinary peasant's cart, with its long snake-like vertebra, calculated to suit the inequalities of the road. On this we were sure to be seated quite a group of homecoming peasants and Czechs. It's not Czechs, it's like Czechs, with their white, and the Slovaks with their colored sheepskins, and the latter carrying a lance fashion in their long staves, with axe at end. As the evening fell, it began to get very cold. The growing twilight seemed to merge into one dark mistiness, the gloom of the trees, oak, beech, and pine. Though in the valleys which ran deep between the spurs of the hills, as we ascended through the pass, the dark firs stood out here and there against the background of the late flying snow. Sometimes, as the road was cut through the pine woods that seemed in the grayness to be closing down upon us, great masses of grayness, which here and there bestrewed the trees, produced a peculiarly weird and solemn effect, which carried on the thoughts and grim fantasies engendered earlier in the evening. When the falling sunset threw into strange relief the ghost-like clouds which amongst the Carpathians seemed to wind ceaselessly through the valleys. Sometimes the winds were so steep that, despite our driver's haste, the horses could only go slowly. I wished to get down and walk up them, as we do at home, but the driver would not hear of it. "No, no," he said, "you must not walk here. The dogs are too fierce." And then he added, with what he evidently meant for grim pleasantry, he looked round to catch the approving smile of the rest, "And you may have enough of such matters before you go to sleep." The only stop he would make was a moment's pause to light his lamps. When it grew dark, there seemed to be some excitement amongst the passengers, and they kept speaking to him, one after the other, as though urging him to further speed. He lashed the horses unmercifully with his long whip, and with wild cries of encouragement urged them to further exertions. And then through the darkness, I could see a sort of patch of grey light ahead of us, as though we were a cleft of the hills. The excitement of the passengers grew greater. The crazy coach rocked on its great leather springs and swayed like boat tossed on the stormy sea. I had to hold on. The road grew more level as we appeared to fly along. Then the mountains seemed to come nearer to us on each side and frown down upon us. Excuse me. We were entering on the Borgo Pass. One by one, several of the passengers offered me gifts, which they pressed upon me with an earnestness which would take no denial. They were certainly of an odd and varied kind, but each was given in simple good faith, with a kindly word and a blessing, and that same strange mixture of fear, meaning, movement, which I had seen outside the hotel at Bistriz, the sign of the cross and the guard against the evil eye. Then, as we flew along, the driver leaned forward, and on each side the passengers, cranking over the edge of the coach, peered eagerly into the darkness. It was evident that something very exciting was either happening or expected. But though I asked each passenger, not one would give me the slightest explanation. This state of excitement kept on for some little time, and at last we saw before us the pass opening out on the eastern side. oppressive sense of thunder. It seemed as though the mountain range had separated two atmospheres, and that now we had got to one into the thunderous one. I was now myself looking out for the conveyance which was to take me to the Count. Each moment I expected to see the glare of lamps through the blackness, but it was all dark. The only light was the flickering rays of our own lamps, from which steam from our hard-driven horses rose in the white cloud. We could see now the sandy road lying white before us, but there was no sign of a vehicle. The passengers drew back with a sigh of gladness, which seemed to mock my own disappointment. I was already thinking what I had to do, when the driver, looking at his watch, said to the others something which I could hardly hear. It was spoken so quietly and so low in tone, I thought it was an hour less than the time. Then turning to me, he spoke in German worse than my own. "There is no carriage here. The heir is not expected after all. He will come on now to Bukovina, and return tomorrow or the next day, better the next day." Whilst he was speaking, the horses began to neigh and snort, and plunge wildly, so that the driver had to hold them up. Then, amongst a chorus of screams from the peasants and a universal crossing of themselves, a calèche, with 4 horses drove up behind us, overtook us, and drew up beside the coach. I could see from the flash of our lamps, as the rays fell upon him, that the horses were coal-black and splendid animals. They were driven by a tall man, with a long brown beard and a great black hat, which seemed to hide his face from us. I could only see a gleam of a pair of very bright eyes, which seemed red in the lamplight. As he turned to us, he said to the driver, "You are early tonight, my friend." The man stammered in reply, "The English heir was in a hurry." To which the stranger replied, "That is why, I suppose, you wished him to go on to Bukovina. You cannot deceive me, my friend. I know too much, and my horses are swift." As he spoke he smiled, and the lamplight fell on a hard-looking mouth, very red lips and sharp-looking teeth, as white as ivory. One of my companions whispered to another the line from the Burger's Lenore, "Den die Tod ten reiten schnell." For the dead travel fast. The strange driver evidently heard the words, for he looked up with a gleaming smile. The passenger turned his face away, at the same time putting out his 2 fingers and crossing himself. "Give me the heir's luggage," said the driver, with the exceeding alacrity My bags were handed out and put in the calèche. Then I descended from the side of the coach, as the calèche was close alongside, the river helping me with a hand, which caught my arm in a grip of steel. His strength must have been prodigious. Without a word, he shook his reins, the horse turned, and we wept into the darkness of the pass. As I looked back, I saw the steam from the horses of the coach by the light of the lamps. Holy shit. As I looked back, I saw the steam from the horses of the coach by the light of the lamps, and projected against it the figures of my late companions crossing themselves. Then the driver cracked his whip and called to his horses, as they wept on their way to Bukovina. As they sank into the darkness, I felt a strange chill, and a lonely feeling come over me. But a cloak was thrown over my shoulders, and a rug across my knees, and the driver said, in excellent German, "The night is chill, mein Herr, and the master of Count bade me to take all care of you. There is a flask of Slivovitz, the plum brandy of this country, underneath the seat, if you should require it." I did not take any, but it was comfort to know it was there all the same. I felt a little strangely, and not a little frightened. I think had there been any alternative, I should have taken it instead of prosecuting that unknown night journey. The carriage went at hard pace straight along, then we made a complete turn and went along another straight road, which seemed to me that we were simply going over the same ground again. And so I took note of some salient point, and found that this was so. I would have liked to have asked the driver what this all meant, but I really feared to do so, for I thought that, placed as I was, any protest would have no effect in case there had been an intention to delay. By and by, however, I was curious to know how time was passing. I struck a match, and by its flame I looked at my watch. It was within a few minutes of midnight. This gave me a sort of shock, for I suppose the general superstition about midnight was increased by my recent experiences. I waited with a sick feeling of suspense. Then a dog began to howl somewhere in a farmhouse far down the road. A long, agonized wailing, as if from fear. The sound was taken up by another dog, and then another, and another, till, borne on the wind, it was now sighed softly through the pass. A wild howling began, which seemed to come from all over the country, as far as the imagination could grasp through the gloom of the night. At the first howl, the horses began to strain and rear, but the driver spoke to them soothingly, and they quieted down, but shivered and sweated as though after a runaway from sudden fright. Then, far off in the distance, from the mountains on each side of us, began a louder and sharper howling, that of wolves, which affected both the horses and myself in the same way. For I was minded to jump from one caleche and run, whilst they reared again and plunged madly, so that the driver had no use at all his great strength to keep them from bolting. In a few minutes, however, my own ears got accustomed to the sound, and the horses so far became quiet that the driver was able to descend and to stand before them. He petted and soothed them, and whispered something in their ears, as I have heard the horse trainer, as I have heard of horse tamers doing, and with extraordinary effect. For under his caress they became quite manageable again, though they still trembled. The driver again took his seat, and shaking the reins, started off at a great pace. This time, after going to the far side of the pass, he suddenly turned down a narrow roadway which ran sharply to the right. Soon we were hemmed in with trees, which in places arched right over the roadway till we passed as through a tunnel. And again great frowning rocks guarded us boldly on either side. Though we were in shelter, we could still hear the rising wind, for it moaned and whistled through the rocks. The branches of the trees crashed together as we swept along. It grew colder and colder still. Fine, powdery snow began to fall, so that soon we and all around us were covered in a white blanket. The keen wind still carried the howling of the dogs, as though this grew fainter as we went on our way. The baying of the wolves sounded nearer and nearer, as though they were closing round on us from every side. I grew dreadfully afraid, and the horses shared my fear. The driver, however, was not in the least bit disturbed. He kept turning his head to left and right, but could not see anything through the darkness. Suddenly, away on our left, I saw a faint flickering blue flame. The driver saw it at the same moment. He at once checked the horses, and, jumping to the ground, disappeared into the darkness. I did not know what to do. The less as the howling of the wolves grew closer. But while I wondered, the driver suddenly appeared again, and without a word took his seat, and we resumed our journey. I think I must have fallen asleep and kept dreaming of the incident, for it seemed to be repeated endlessly, and now looking back, it is a sort of awful nightmare. Once the flame appeared so near the road that even in the darkness around us I could watch the driver's motions. He went rapidly to where the blue flame arose, but it must have been very faint, for it did not seem to illuminate the place around it at all, and gathering a few stones, formed them into some device. Once there appeared a strange optical effect. When he stood between me and the flame, he did not obstruct it, for I could see its ghostly flicker all the same. This startled me, but as the effect was only momentary, I took it that my eyes deceived me straying through the darkness. Then, for a time, there was no blue flames, and we sped onwards through the gloom, with the howling of the wolves around us, as though they were following in a moving circle. At last, there came a time when the driver went further afield than he had yet gone, and during the absence the horses began to tremble worse than ever, and to snort and scream with fright. I could not see any cause for it. The howling of the wolves had ceased altogether. But then it was just the moon, sailing through the black clouds, appeared behind the jagged crest of the beetling, pine-clad rock, and by its light I saw around us a ring of wolves, with white teeth and lolling red tongues. With long sinewy limbs and shaggy hair, they were 100 times more terrible in the grim silence which held them than ever when they had howled. For myself, I felt a sort of paralysis of fear. It is only when a man feels himself face to face with such horrors that he can understand their true import. All at once the wolves began to howl as though the moonlight had some particular effect on them. The horses jumped about and reared, and looked helplessly round with eyes that rolled in a way painful to see. But the living ring of terror encompassed them on every side, and they had perforce to remain within it. I called to the coachman to come, for it seemed to me that our only chance was to try to break through the ring and to aid his approach. I shouted and beat the side of the caleche, hoping by the noise to scare the wolves from the side, so as to give him a chance of reaching the trap. How he came here, I know not, but I heard his voice raised in a tone of imperious command, and, looking towards the sound, saw him stand in the roadway, and he swept his long arms as though brushing aside some palpable obstacle. The wolves fell back, and back further still. Just then a heavy cloud passed across the face of the moon, so that we were again in darkness. When I could see again, the driver was climbing into the caleche, and the wolves disappeared. This was all so strange and uncanny that a dreadful fear came upon me. I was so afraid to speak or move. The time seemed interminable as we swept along on our way. Now in almost complete darkness, for the rolling clouds obscured the moon. We kept on ascending, with occasional periods of quick descent, but in the main always ascending. Suddenly I became conscious of the fact that the driver was in the act of pulling up the horses in the courtyard of a vast ruined castle, from whose tall black windows came no ray of light, and whose broken battlements showed a jagged line against the sky. Chapter 2. Jonathan Harker's journal continued. I think we'll continue this next time because holy shit, one chapter is friggin' 20 pages. It took me however long this video is. I will continue to read. I'm gonna make a habit of this, I promise. Reading something good. Thank you again for listening. I hope you enjoyed the content. Farewell. Thank you for listening.